Hi guys, my name is Ole from Ole8's Photography, and today I'm gonna show you how I edit my landscape photos, or at least some of my landscape photos. For this I'm using Lightroom and Photoshop, and we're gonna take this image and turn it into this. So like I said, it's a workflow tutorial. You can follow along and do everything at the same time. Just pause in between. I'm not giving in-depth instructions with each and every tool. Like I said, it's a workflow tutorial. So what I do, I open it in Lightroom. I start there, I do my basics there. I throw it in Photoshop. Most of my edits is done there. Then I kind of throw it back in Lightroom, do my final edits there and export it from Lightroom. For this tutorial I use third-party software. I use TK Actions, Tony Cooper's Actions. There is a link in the descriptions for that. Check it out, it's very good. It's what I use. There are many other tools like that. I use it for luminosity masking. So whatever you're using, you can use it, but it's not the same steps, obviously, but it's always very similar. Also, I'm using Nik Software. That's more like familiar with most people. They had kind of a, difficult time. They got bought by Google and Google discontinued it, but they have been rescued and it's up and running again. There's also a link in the description for that. So let's dive right in. Okay, let's see this. This is the photo I'm going to work with. As you can see, this is a really nice composition, but the light was not great. And but that's fine. You don't always need to have a massive, impressive sunset to be able to shoot. You should shoot in every light. The first part of the workflow is kind of doing basic things. This is shot with a wide angle lens. So I usually do the enabled profile corrections here. And also, because I do have really high contrast areas, you could maybe see a little green line here on top of this, right in the intersection of the contrast areas here. If I just check this, it just completely disappears. I would like to wash out the blacks a little bit, and I do that here in the tone curve. I just lift the black, and you can see from this to about nothing too much, and you can see here in the histogram I'm limiting the space on the histogram. It's not allowed anymore to go completely black, and I usually do that in my landscape images. I do not like very black areas. I like it softer, kind of washed out. That's kind of my preference of doing things. Also, I would maybe lift the shadows a little bit here. As you can see, it's a little bit, it's a little dark. I didn't bracket. I didn't need to. All of my histogram was inbounds, so it wasn't clipping the shadows, and it wasn't clipping the highlights. So I didn't really need to bracket here. Even if the clouds, the sky, the open area here in the clouds is iffy, but according to the histogram, it had information, so I did not. So to get that a little bit back, I would try to lower the highlights a little bit, not too much. I have luminosity tools, luminosity mask in Photoshop to do this better, because if I do this, this is very global. I'm kind of doing this to all the image. It loses a lot of information from other places I don't want, but I do it a little bit, you know, so I can get a little space here at the right end of the histogram. It's also a little, the white balance is a little off. It's too blue, so I'm just increasing the warmth here a little bit. I don't use the color picker, and I just do it by eye like this, and you know, you just be careful with the tint, the green and the magenta. If you have a green tone, you know, you should try to get rid of that, but sometimes it gets a little magenta instead, and you know, green like that and magenta like this, not the way to go. It looks really, really bad. So I'm just gonna leave it for now. This is basically, you know, I prepared it enough for what I want to do in Photoshop. So what I do now, I just right click here on the thumbnail, select edit in, and edit in Adobe Photoshop. And here we go, this is now opened in Photoshop, and you can see here on the right area here, I have a different tool set here. This is the TK actions I mentioned earlier. It has a lot of tools, but I basically just use the luminosity masks of this. There's a lot of other stuff, great stuff you can do here, but I only use that. First of all, I select a levels adjustment, and here on the TK layer mask, because the adjustment tools, they stack up like layers, so I can treat them as layers, layer mask. I can apply this to the image itself, but in this workflow it doesn't make any sense. Add in a level. It comes here also in TK control. Here's the same level adjustment as you can see here in the adjustment, the typical Photoshop way to do it. So, and here I'm gonna start with the darks. I'm gonna lift the darks even more. But you can see here in the darks palette here, it's from 1 to 5. 5 being the darkest, super dark, and up to 1. Usually just want to go super dark. I try that at least. So you can see here it completely eliminates the histogram. It doesn't mean there's no info. So if I drag the slider down, you can see how it washes out the black color. And not too much, then you're gonna mess everything up. How much? I don't know, depends on the image and your preference. So I'm gonna, you know, be right about here. Then I put another one, another level, and I go to lights, and I don't know, let's try number 4, 5 being the lightest. So I want to get back. See, when I push it up a little bit, I can see there is a little bit of color that was in the sky, but it didn't really show at normal exposure. But if you bring the exposure in the lights down with this luminosity mask tools, you can kind of push the color we had. Now the image looks kind of flat, and now I'm gonna make it even darker, do another level, and I'm gonna do midtones now. So 2, I like the curve, I selected 2, I like the curve to be kind of tight here in the middle, leaving the dark and the bright areas, and I just want to work with the midtones a little bit, and I pull that down something like that. If I feel like the black is too black now, I can move back on the black layers where I selected the super black here, and do more and light that up more. Something like that. So what I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna stamp visible layers, which, you know, I'm gonna take all these layers, stamp it, and make one layer here on top. Here's the shortcut for that. So now I have a new layer with everything here on the bottom. So this, I don't really need this, but I do actually, because I might do a little transparency on that layer. So I'm gonna blur this layer quite a bit. I'm gonna make an Orton effect. So I'm gonna blur this layer a lot. Filter, blur, and the Gaussian blur. So the value, I don't know, a lot, you know, something like that. I know it doesn't look much now, but again, bear with me. The exact value here is, it depends, like before, it depends on your preferences and the image. This is something you just have to experience with your own images. Okay. And now I want to lighten the dark areas of the image. There are many ways to do that. I'm gonna do it by selecting the overlay to screen, the layer overlay to screen. So what it does, it lightens the whole image a little bit too much, but then I just change the opacity to get that back a little bit. And there are two things that I'm watching here. I'm watching both the brightness level and also the softness. You know, the Orton effects kind of like soften up the image a little bit. And I like it soft, but not too soft. So, you know, again, personal taste, how much you're gonna do this. But even if, now you can see, you know, I like it like this. It's soft, but I'm missing the contrast. Now I need to bring back some of the contrast. And I stamp visible again. There are many ways to increase the contrast back, put back the contrast and the micro contrast back in the image. You could do high pass or some of the other tools Photoshop has. I do like the tonal contrast in Nik tools. So I'm gonna do that. I go to Nik Collections and Color Effects Pro. And, you know, it's already selected here, but let's say it wasn't. So tonal contrast is here. I select that. It does have some default values. They tend to be quite, you know, a little bit too high for my taste, but, you know, again, personal preference. But what it does bring the contrast back to the image. I take the checkbox off, see it before and after. This is one of those things, you know, you need to be a bit careful with. It's, you know, it's very easy to overdo it here. And I do use another Nik filter, but I rarely stack them up in Nik, because If I stack them up in Nik Software, it's going to be on one layer in Photoshop, and I can't control each effect. So let's see, something like that. Okay, now I got my tonal contrast layer. I can do off and on, and I can, you know, adjust the opacity if I feel it's too much. But when I'm satisfied, I'm just gonna leave it about 90. I stamp again to get a new layer with every adjustment on. I go to Filter and Nik Collections again. Color Effects Pro. And for that, I like to use Pro Contrast also. Neutral. I do kind of like sometimes the correct color cast in this software is nice, you know, because it feels a little too blue now. But I'm gonna, yeah, this is okay. I'm gonna leave it with that, something like that, and increase the dynamic contrast a little bit to get more of the micro contrasts back after the Orton Effect. Something like that. Just check it by taking out, just check the before and after, always, while you're adjusting the image. And when you're satisfied, just hit OK. All right. I stamp it again. And now I'm gonna go to Filter, and I'm gonna pick Camera Raw Filter. It's the same thing, the same settings basically you're getting in Lightroom. So I'm gonna see if I can you know, get a little better color here for this image. Just it feels a little green, so I'm gonna move the tint a little up towards magenta. But I don't want a magenta cast in it either, so you know, just find your sweet spot somewhere here. And then of course you can go to HSL adjustments and deal with the saturation. If you feel like there is kind of too much of some color tone going on here, I decrease the agua, and it improves. You know, it's the agua is the color kind of the aqua is the color that I wasn't really happy with here. So something like that, Maybe if I could, you know, put the orange and yellow up a little bit to increase the contrast here in the sky. Something like that. Okay. Now I'm quite happy with the result. And I'm gonna merge those layers, because every time you stamp, you are adding a whole image to the layer stack, so it's gonna slow your computer down. So I'm gonna right click and just flatten image like that. Don't do it until you're sure that what you have is what you want. But I'm not gonna do anything more in Photoshop. Instead, I'm gonna save it. And open it up here in Lightroom again. There are very few things left. I like it a little darker. I like it sharper. You know, I like to add a little clarity and you know, give it a little punch. If I'm gonna use it for like on a website or just on Facebook or something like that, I can really, you know, add those things to make it pop, and it's gonna look good on the screen. If I take the same result and send it to a printer, it's gonna look bad. It's gonna be over sharp, it's gonna be too dark, it's gonna be bad. So I just have the you know, near completed picture here in Lightroom. Then I just add darkness and add sharpness and stuff, you know, depending on what I'm doing with the file. I would like it a bit darker, something like that, and up the whites a little bit. That gives a little contrast, and shadows maybe a little bit too dark. I don't know. Here I have the clarity slider. Not too much. Too much clarity gives this really weird HDR look, and it takes away the colors. So clarity is, you know, just use it something like that. And then there's this sharpening tool here. You can add that. You know, you can go crazy here if you're going to use this for web. It looks really sharp and nice here. But if you're going to do prints, you better be careful here. You know, it's over sharp images look really bad in print. So here, you know, I feel this the color is slightly off still. So I'm gonna try to deal with that a little bit here with this the HSL saturation slider here. I might change the hue a little bit also. Let's see. I can take. You can see the this is the color. If I increase it, this is the color which is, you know, giving me a hard time. If I take that towards blue a little bit, it looks better. And yeah, something like that. You know, there's no exact science here behind this. What I'm doing now, I'm just looking at it and trying to find something that looks good for me. Something like that. Yeah. I like to add a little vignette sometimes. I just check because it really kind of directs the eye. Something like that. And maybe give it a little contrast boost. But when you're editing, always look at your darkest spots and your lightest spots. These are the problem areas. So here it's, you know, I put my slider on it, and I can see in the top right corner where the histogram is, I have information here. You know, it's not all maxed out. So this is okay. And I can also see here that I have information, but it's a little bit too dark for me. I want it something like that. Maybe desaturate it a little bit. There we go. Here, look at this. This is a little bit black. So I might not do a global adjustment here because I added the vignette. I might take that a little bit back. Just make a little bit, and then I would just use the brush. Be careful that everything else is as it's 0, and I want to open up the shadows a little bit. So, but just with the brush here, you see, it's usually just small adjustments that does the trick. You rarely need to do something from 0 to 100 always, but just a little bit to open up the shadows. Maybe a little bit here also, something like that. Here, like like that. But to export from Lightroom is absolutely brilliant, because you know, you just right click on it, export, and export, and then it just, you know, you put your desired folder like that. If you want to rename it, you know, you do that. Custom name. And this is the waterfall of gods, or Godaphos. And then you have your your color space. If you're gonna do prints, you need to leave it at Adobe RGB. If you're gonna do web stuff, you know, for Facebook or just on a web page or something like that, you will need to pick the sRGB. So, but sometimes different printers have different color settings. So the easiest way to know is to get that information from the printer. For Facebook, if I'm gonna publish this on Facebook, I always use pixels here, and I just use 72 in resolution, pixels per inch. That's just an industry standard. And for the long ads, I use 2048, which is a good size for Facebook. You know, you always have to check if you're saving things for Facebook or for you know, Flickr or whatever you're doing. You need to check the optimal size in pixels, because if you have that wrong, the quality and the sharpness is gonna suffer. So on Facebook, it's good to have the long ads in 2048, and then if you have a watermark, you can, you know, put that in. Just add it. If you don't have it, you need to add that first, obviously, but I have it, so I just check it if I want it or not, and then I press export. So here's my before and after. Pretty pleased with the result. I like the hint of yellow that I'm able to squeeze out of it without adding anything. I don't add anything to my photos. I just try to squeeze every bit of information I have available. So I hope you found this useful and enjoyed this. It's not a very detailed tutorial. I'm not going in depth in, you know, and showing you where everything is. So I guess it's kind of an advanced, but it's to show you my workflow, how I do things. And so, like I said, hope you enjoyed. Thank you.